If I use, that's a bit better maybe, huh? Hi, everybody. Yeah, there was a bit of a conflict. I don't know whether you've read your WhatsApp messages. Oh, wow. Welcome, everybody. Great to see that there is interest for critical virtual exchange. Good. All right. All right. I don't know. I mean, Sharon can't come today. She is examining a PhD, from what I understand. She was, and she has left it to Fran and I to run the show, basically. Obviously, together with you, we are happy to see you. Then that there is interest. Can I just ask, while we wait a couple more seconds, does virtual exchange mean anything to anybody in this virtual room? Just out of curiosity.
Or COIL, maybe some people might be familiar with COIL.
COIL, yeah. Collaborative Online International Learning. Does that mean anything to anybody here? I've seen Penny. I'm sure Penny knows about COIL.
Yep, I know about COIL. Yes, thanks. How are you, Miriam?
I'm good. I'm good. You probably have a bit of a déjà vu, because if you listen to my keynote at IWEC, a few slides might look familiar, but I have...
Oh, that's fine.
Yeah, I've got Fran with me. New perspectives, more criticality,
good.
more angles.
Yeah, nice. Hello, Fran.
Hi. It would be really nice to know where you're connecting from. If people could write in the chat where you're connecting from and what you do, it would be a bit interactive.
Okay, I start sharing the screen.
I
start sharing the screen. And then I want to go into presentation. Oh, my slideshow from beginning. Yeah. Can you see this? Can everybody see this?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you so much. So obviously, you know this from Zoom. I cannot see the chat. I think, Fran, you can still see the chat, though.
I can see the chat, yeah.
Yeah, okay, I can see. We'll try to multitask. If you feel your voice is not being heard, then feel free to repeat what you've said in the chat immediately afterwards.
Yeah.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
Good. Right. Are you ready, Fran?
I'm ready. I'm just reading the text chat to see where people are connecting from. Great.
Great. Fantastic. So I think we are going to roll.
Mm-hmm.
So this is about doing critical internationalization through critical virtual exchange. And we hail from the other side of the Atlantic. Fran in Italy, and I'm in the UK. Now, these are our talking points. We will introduce you to virtual exchange, different virtual exchange models. We'll talk a little bit about internationalization at home. We talk about challenges associated with virtual exchange, issues of equity and power in particular. And then we introduce the concept of critical virtual exchange and what critical virtual exchange could be, what the guiding principles should be for critical virtual exchange. And we hope to explore all of this further with you. So we don't come with ready-made answers, we come with suggestions. Right, so what is virtual exchange, also known as collaborative online international learning, or globally networked learning, or collaboration? You might have heard any of these terms. It is a practice supported by research that consists of sustained technology-mediated people-to-people education programs or individual activities in which constructive communication in interaction takes place between individuals or groups who are geographically separated and who are also from different cultural backgrounds, and all of this with the support of educators and facilitators. Now, to sum it up,
I usually just run a hard drive.
hello, I can hear somebody talking.
iCloud.
So if you do
Miriam,
not
do you want
talk,
to make me co-host and I can
I can't come out of the presentation now. Just if you don't talk, let me just see. If you don't talk, please do switch off your mic. Okay, I just see whether I can do anything. No, I can't. Sorry. So virtual exchange, to cut a long story short, it combines the deep impact of intercultural dialogue and exchange with the broad reach of digital technology. Fran.
And so I suppose we're in a sense, we're relative newcomers to epistemologies of the South and critical approaches to internationalization. But one thing we have learned is to make explicit our locus of enunciation, so where we're speaking from. And as Miriam said, she's in the UK and I'm in Italy, so we're very much located in the European context. And we have backgrounds in language teaching and technology in education. We've worked in, we've collaborated a lot in policy experimentations, which are very European oriented. And we're also aware we're talking about virtually connecting, and we're in Europe where there is a 90% internet penetration rate, though of course there are still many inequities in relation to this, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Next.
Okay, if you don't talk, please mute your mic, everybody, please.
So there are different models of virtual exchange. Miriam gave a kind of description of what it is, and there, you know, it plays out in the classroom in different ways. But I'd like to distinguish two kind of main models we have. And so there is the ready-made dialogue-based exchanges, which involve participants from many different locations and many different universities. And due to this kind of large scale of these exchanges, they are normally developed and managed by specialist organizations, such as Solia and Sharing Perspectives Foundation. And they create partnerships with universities where the exchanges are integrated into courses or offered as standalone courses. And then another form of virtual exchange is the collaboratively designed and implemented by two or more university educators who want to integrate an international and intercultural dimension into their already existing but soon to become transformed courses. And this is perhaps also the COIL model, which some of you are familiar with. So virtual exchange also exists in other education sectors outside of in secondary education, and it's also developed in peace building and this other sphere as well. Mm-hmm. And just to give a couple of examples, the Sharing Perspectives Foundation, which is working in the European Erasmus Plus virtual exchange project. So they provide these ready-made exchanges, and they're currently implementing the Big Climate Movement exchange. And there are actually over 1,000 people in Europe and European and Southern Mediterranean countries. So we have Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, Syria, and various other countries. So with these over 1,000 participants, they're organized into small groups of say 10 to 15 people. And you can see, I think, in the window below what the exchanges look like. So they meet the same group of people every week for 2 hours to have a dialogue session with the support of experienced facilitators. before the session, they watch short videos and they might read a text, and they every week there is a slightly different focus for the discussion. What they do is they bring together the local context. So they're talking about the climate story in their local context, but it's also a global issue. So what they do with the facilitators each week is make relevant their local knowledges and talk about this global issue and how it is impacting them. So the global conversations on this global issue is a way of exercising critical consciousness and agency, in the hope that they will eventually, work together towards climate and social justice.
Okay, and this is an example for a co-designed exchange where educators, in this particular case, a colleague from Argentina, a colleague from Poland, and a colleague from Sweden came together with their cohorts of learners and created a virtual exchange on the topic of reading the city, popular, personal, and critical perspectives on urban life. So it was about studying the city as text. Focus was very much on critical multiliteracy and the promotion of intercultural communicative competence through virtual exchange, through working in cross-cultural groups. So it was about looking at the city as a popular, critical, and personal place of study, and exploiting the potential of multimodal meaning making by comparing and discussing official visitor websites in your respective cities in the first phase of the project, and then to look at the stories and values that these websites promote. And then also share examples of how your cities figure in the news and in aesthetic texts such as literature, poetry, or music. But then also in phase 2, to identify some controversial aspects, some controversial issues associated with your cities. And this could be about segregation, poverty, crime, different kinds of prejudice and pollution, and develop a project to bring these to the world on a website, for example. And it was intentionally linked, this virtual exchange, to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal number 11, make cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. Now, in higher education, many see virtual exchange as the solution to internationalization at home, a term, as you might know, that was coined in 1998 at Malmö University in Sweden, when there was a growing immigrant population, and made it clear that there was a need for intentional intercultural learning between domestic and international students. And on the screen, you see a definition for internationalization at home. And for the purpose of our talk, we will use internationalization at home and internationalization of the curriculum as synonyms. Internationalization at home strategies in higher education are usually driven by the fact that the majority of higher education students are not internationally mobile, but that universities are still seen as being responsible for preparing students for a globally interconnected world, helping them develop their international intercultural skills. And as you know, these are umbrella terms for a whole range of so-called soft skills and transversal skills like openness, curiosity, empathy, problem solving, critical thinking, and conflict management, to name a few. And this internationalization at home through virtual exchange trend is reinforced by a growing number of educators who are concerned about the sustainability and the environmental impact of international mobility, and who call for other, more climate neutral forms of mobility and exchange. And last but not least, the current pandemic has added its own weight to the argument in favor of VE. Oops, this slide is slightly out of sync. At a recent webinar hosted by Class to Class on increasing student engagement when faced with limited physical mobility, Mary Lou Forward, the director of the COIL Center in the US, said, in this time of remote teaching and learning, virtual exchange is a way to connect and engage learners and give them meaningful and authentic assignments rather than disposable assignments That's why we focus on project-based collaborations in virtual exchange with real-world consequences. And when she explained why there is now more and more institutional interest in virtual exchange, she said, we live in a time of tremendous social change, and people are demanding social justice and the need to make sustained connections, understand where other people are coming from, to be able to transform our own societies into the kind of places we want for the future. And that is another reason that's driving institutions to think about diversity in all its forms, including cultural diversity and international diversity. So people like Francesca and I, who've been in virtual exchange for almost 2 decades, are very happy to see that virtual exchange is finally moving from the margins towards the center of the educational landscape. Frank.
But at the same time are concerned with questions of related to equity and power, because of course they also operate in the digital space as we use virtual exchange, and the digital spaces shapes ways of thinking and doing that perpetuate social and cultural inequalities, both online and offline. And so these really need to be brought to the fore in the exchanges and also in our research on virtual exchange. And so we want to unpick some of the assumptions and ideologies in the discourses surrounding educational technologies, particularly now that, you know, at this time, technology is suddenly become of extreme interest and is high on the agendas. But there are also a lot of sharks and problems with edtech companies now kind of breaking into universities. And one of the issues, so we, both Miriam and I, come from language education, and for us, virtual exchange has always been about finding opportunities for students to interact with others and practice the foreign language they are learning. So it's been, you know, a kind of bilingual or multilingual exchanges. Language has always been a key focus for us. But as it becomes more widespread practice, and we, particularly in the case of these large-scale virtual exchanges, English is increasingly used. And so there is this dominance of English also in, you know, due to the internationalization of higher education. And while both English and technology can serve as tools in higher education to facilitate the exchange and sharing of knowledges between people from linguistically and culturally diverse areas of the world, we need to be aware of the political and social dimensions of the ways in which both English and technology are being used, and the power dynamics that educational practices create. And so also, to what extent are our educational practices prioritizing certain kinds of knowledge and reinforcing social and epistemic inequalities and injustices? If we think of the concept of ecologies of knowledge, and the constraints we're working in, we realize that there are some severe limitations. In terms of, I mean, the most obvious is access to internet and internet penetration. And we can see the divergences that there are here, but it's not only, obviously, so if you don't have access to internet, then you're not going to be able to participate in virtual exchange. But it's not just a question of having access, it's also, you know, how many devices are there in a family of 5, 6, 7? This is an issue also in Europe. Are there quiet spaces where people can connect from? Do people have time to dedicate to online exchanges, you know, when they're busy trying to make a living and survive in this context? And also digital literacy is the way we use technology in order to support our learning. So English and technology are just two of the kind of barriers we have, but also the idea of whose knowledges and experiences are made relevant in virtual exchange. And even in bilateral exchanges between two teachers, the terms under which the exchange takes place can be influenced by many different factors. So if we think of the socio-historical and or geopolitical factors, what is the context that it's taking place in? Institutional interests may determine which, particularly when COIL is institutionalized, which universities, which countries are of strategic interest. I've already mentioned access to an experience and the use of technology. but also in a partnership, the teaching partners' academic positions and beliefs and how they relate to one another, issues of gender, race, age, which also affect the dynamics and how a joint curriculum is negotiated between others. Language used, language levels, but also the ethos towards communication. How open are we to understanding that English is a language of translation, and we're translating and making different meanings understood. So we need to be open towards the communication, not looking at correctness or standards of English. And then institutional constraints. What conditions are we working under, and how does that support equity in the virtual exchange itself? And so we can have, if you like, hegemonic and non-hegemonic forms of virtual exchange. So Sousa Santos writes about the abyssal line and hegemonic versus non-hegemonic forms of globalizations. And in a similar vein, this applies to virtual exchange. Though they're not necessarily so distinct from another. In presenting it in a table, it kind of simplifies it. I think there is, overlap and intertwining of these issues. But we would see perhaps a hegemonic approach to virtual exchange is where a specific body of knowledge or certain competences need to be mastered. So these are defined before the exchange is put into place. There's a strong focus on employability in Europe. What they kind of keep talking about is employability, global competences to make the individual more employable. This idea of surfing diversity to evoke positive feelings. So, managing diversity and tolerating difference, which I think is a horrible way of phrasing it, in order to complete a collaborative task, because we have to stay on mission and complete what we're supposed to do. Forgetting or ignoring history and focusing on common values. Another example could be the global north seeking solutions to challenges in the global south. Now, there's a lot about kind of challenge-based learning, entrepreneurial skills, but we could recreate this dynamic where it's students in the global north are finding solutions to problems in the global south and extracting the information from people in order to think they are helping by finding these solutions. And then enhancing the liberal elite cosmopolitanism of the individual. So, one comes, enhances their individual competences, but there is no reflection on the collectivity. Whereas a non-hegemonic approach would be based on reciprocity and mutualism, mutual learning, mutual exchange, and support, creating opportunities for unlearning the things we think we have learned, learning and then relearning, making participants' locus of enunciation relevant and reflecting on the situatedness of our knowledges, but without going into essentialisms and simplifications. Changing the terms of the conversation in order to relocalize the global. Making time for listening. Listening, I think, is at the core of a deep dialogic approach to intercultural exchange. But also change. Participants are challenged and changed by the interactions they have in virtual exchange. Over to you, my dear Miriam.
Yes, so we have been thinking about a way forward in virtual exchange, and we would like to propose a few concepts that could inform the way we do virtual exchange, institutionalized virtual exchange, internationalization at home through virtual exchange in particular in the future. And we hope that these concepts, principles help us address, maybe even overcome the challenges we've highlighted, and can contribute to global fairness in the digital space. And they may even allow us to position virtual exchange as an activity that advances institutional objectives for equity and inclusion, and that speaks to a much needed social justice agenda in higher education institutions around the world. We're talking about the concept of othering and belonging, critical digital literacy, epistemological humility and temporality, and brave space. What they have in common is a sense of agency, more specifically a critical consciousness and critical agency in the sense of Paulo Freire and Giroux, that is the ability to read the world critically and the ability to act in the world to change it. Now, let's start with othering and belonging. In the joint article published in Othering and Belonging, Expanding the Circle of Human Concern, Powell and Menedian, the director and assistant director of the Haas Institute for a Fair and Inclusive Society at Berkeley, describe the problem of the 21st century as the problem of othering. Othering, a set of dynamics, processes and structures that engender marginality and persistent inequality across any of the full range of human differences based on group identities. So religion, sex, race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, disability, sexual orientation, and skin tone. Now, in virtual exchanges, why we mention this, practitioners often work with stereotypes in the initial phase of an exchange, also called the icebreaker exchange, warm-up phase, when the two student cohorts get to know each other. But we know from published research that working with stereotypes can be highly counterproductive and may actually lead to a hardening of our assumptions and the preconceived ideas that we have of the others. The underlying problem, obviously, is a monolithic and essentialist view of culture. Stereotyping is a mechanism of separation, which is why we propose that we work with the concepts of othering and otherness, belonging and togetherness in virtual exchange instead. Powell and Menedian point out that in a world beset by seemingly intractable and overwhelming challenges, virtually every global, national and regional conflict is wrapped within or organized around one or more dimensions of group-based difference. Othering undergirds territorial disputes, sectarian violence, military conflict, the spread of disease, hunger, and food insecurity, and even climate change. Now, they do acknowledge that human beings have a natural tendency to make categorical distinctions, that is, to stereotype, but the categories themselves and the meanings associated with those categories are socially constructed rather than naturally. And this is where virtual exchange work can make a difference by systematically exploring these socially constructed categories and the motivations that underpin them. In a talk that you will find on YouTube, John Powell explains the mechanisms of othering. He distinguishes between what happens at a conscious level and what happens at an unconscious level in terms of othering, and says, oftentimes we think that the way we actually connect is not to see that we have differences, and we are afraid of differences at the conscious level. So we say we all have to be the same. In the context of virtual exchange research, Ware and Crumsch 2009 call this the illusion of communality. In another talk, Per Wilson asks, this is a TED talk, is there a path from otherness to togetherness? And she explains how her background and identity have given her unique experience with otherness and how it can affect our ability to care about or connect with other people. She has spent 13 years working for Make-A-Wish, for the Make-A-Wish Foundation, dedicated to the mission and the mission of this foundation and the power to transform lives one wish at a time. What she says is also echoed, I don't know, you're probably familiar with Maha Bali, her blog, her education blog, in her post on the 28th of May of this year with the title Pedagogy of Care, COVID-19 edition. She talks about creating spaces where students can support each other socio-emotionally and where there is a sense of belonging. And this is where virtual exchange has a role to play. Now, another educational argument in favor of virtual exchange is that it promotes the development of digital literacy, especially the ability to communicate and collaborate effectively online for learning and for professional purposes. It's by default mediated by technology, so it's on-the-job training. But we do know that the transformative impact of digital technologies in education has yet to happen, and that they have not yet led to greater equality and inclusion. If anything, the COVID-19 and the worldwide move to online learning and teaching has shown very clearly how limited and lack of access to technology, Fran has already mentioned it, has led to even more inequality and more exclusion. And we've argued in our virtual exchange work that digital literacy provision needs to be anchored in real life settings and take account of the wider sociopolitical context, which is also important for understanding the broader concept of digital citizenship. And only then, when we do that, can we and our learners begin to see the problems that come with our often uncritical consumptions of technology. So VEs happen in real life settings, and they are by default mediated by technology. They provide an ideal setting for such contextualization and for fostering critical consciousness and agency in the spirit of Freire's critical pedagogy. So we make the case for critical digital literacy, the way it's been framed by Darwin, and critical digital pedagogy, the way it's been framed by Morris. This critical digital literacy you see on this slide, and critical digital pedagogy, discovering methods of establishing presence and voice online, and to reach out to others who are trying to discover the same. Such a pedagogy considers the impact the digital has on our lives, and this is why we think that there is a natural fit between critical digital literacy and intercultural literacy, which can both be developed in the conversational spaces of virtual exchange. Of course, again, is there a double bind? We said it earlier, virtual environments are not ideologically neutral. They steer learners to normative behaviors and meanings. They shape how learners position each other, how they perform identities, how information is legitimated, and how it is distributed. But critical digital literacy helps understand how technologies are used in situated and encultured ways, how the material dimensions of online spaces can be indicative of dominant ideologies, economies, and institutions. We need to bring this to the fore in our virtual exchange work. Now, we look a bit more closely at discovering methods for establishing presence and voice and reaching out to others who are trying to discover the same. Morris's understanding of critical digital pedagogy. Here in this article, in the Nautilus Quarterly, it's a New York-based science magazine, on the man who saw the pandemic coming, Dennis Carroll, an epidemiologist at the One Health Institute at the University of California, Davis, he was asked what worried him most about the coronavirus. And then this is what he said. He said, "I'm stunned by the absolute absence of global dialogue for what is a global event." Now we see this as a unique opportunity to use virtual exchange to plug the gap and to foster global conversations on global issues, and not just in relation to COVID and global health issues. And therefore we think that we should, and some of us are already well on their way, we should aim for a systematic alignment of our virtual exchange work with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Now, another thought. You're probably familiar with the idea of virtual exchange as an educational third space. Some of you might be, where the students negotiate with their learning partners for intercultural learning, a space for the exchange of views and the growth of intercultural understanding. Bax and Pegrom, we conceive of it as a social constructivist learning space in which deconstruction and reconstruction of knowledge and understanding can occur. Learning, unlearning, relearning, Francesca talked about, and the space which the students themselves shape as they invest themselves in the learning community. To us, this indicates that there is ample scope for critical agency in Freire's sense. Now, with reference to S in the context of third space discussions, Pegrom adds the need to develop epistemological humility. The need to develop that in our learners. Simply speaking, that is the realization that one's own perspective of the world is not the only one. And I would like us to differentiate more clearly and suggest that epistemological humility comes first and is actually the precondition for intercultural understanding. Why do I say this? Because we often hear and read that one of the main takeaways from virtual exchange, collaborative online international learning, was the realization among participants that the others are, after all, not that different, what I called the illusion of communality earlier. This tends to happen when the exchanges only scrape the surface, when they remain at the food, fashion, and folklore level of intercultural experience. More insightful learning happens when students, in their reflections about an exchange there, that they've mostly found out about themselves, in particularly that there are many different perspectives and worldviews apart from their own. We take this for granted, but many learners are not there yet. Now, once we have achieved epistemological humility in ourselves and our learners, then we can be more ambitious and move on to phase 2, develop intercultural understanding, intercultural learning. And again, I would at the same time warn against a superficial understanding of this third space where all this work can happen. Because the digital spaces where most virtual exchange work takes place, they're not neutral grounds. You've said this before, they're not necessarily leveling spaces. We know that there is no such thing as a neutral online space. The internet is based on specific cultural principles and values, and users bring with them their own culturally specific communicative norms and behaviors, which may or may not be compatible with those of others. Helm, Francesca, reminds us how online technologies have been used, or rather abused, to polarize communities, to entrench hate, and to radicalize youth in particular. How they've allowed individuals to self-segregate into online echo chambers where their own opinions are reinforced because there is little exposure to different views. So we think that virtual exchange is a way of counteracting this trend of using online technologies for constructive engagement with difference, with otherness, and for building positive relations. And finally, the idea of a brave space, that virtual exchange is a brave space. If we are willing to engage with the socio-political embeddedness of technology, we can turn virtual exchange into brave spaces where we accept the likelihood that we will be uncomfortable when investigating issues such as race, privilege, and oppression, and our roles within it. A brave space encourages dialogue but recognizes difference. And it is often hard to do this work, sharing experiences, holding people accountable for their views, and coming to new understandings. And just so that you have another look, this is what happens, what Solia Connect does. They provide this kind of brave space. And again, also the sharing perspective foundations we talked about earlier. What all these approaches have in common is a focus on critical agency. Now, to sum up, we think we can do critical internationalization through critical VE that is informed by the principles that we've presented, that forces us to move outside of our comfort zone as educators, critical virtual exchange as a vehicle for action, for change, through multiple touch points, so that it's not just a one-off experience our learners have, but maybe several virtual exchanges for several terms. So for short, mid, and long-term impact, where they learn to systematically reach out to others who want to have a voice online. So virtual exchange that is non-hegemonic, virtual exchange that advances equity, inclusion, and social justice for global fairness in the digital space, and that at the same time promotes a critical approach to internationalization at home, and that helps shape the new different. Thank you. Oh wow, it's a full house, 35 people. Questions? I hope we haven't stunned you into silence.
You could stop sharing.
Yeah, I will do that. But then I can't bring up those slides. Well, I could reshare if you want to say.
We could share
else,
them on
yeah.
Google Slides, maybe.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you for listening. You've probably looked at the chat, Fran.
Yes, but no questions.
Any reactions? Yeah.
I have a question. I'm unmuting because it seems like it'll be too hard to write in the chat.
Yeah, yeah, of course, go for it.
It'd be nice to see everyone, whoever wants to be seen.
I can start my video. Hi, I'm Minda Lopez. You're so many good things. Thank you so much. So there's a lot to still think about. But one of the things I've been wondering about is about virtual exchange with non-university partners, and thinking about how that might provide more access to more people. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that. It seems like a lot of the critical exchange is university to university. And some of what I've engaged in is not university to university, it's university to NGO or community group. And I've done that strategically. And I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
I can talk a little bit to the experience that in the Erasmus Virtual Exchange program, which we were working on with the European Commission, we're trying to work with youth organizations, so not NGOs, but rather youth organizations, so people who are out of formal education. And there it was actually really challenging, because it's to get into a deep kind of a dialogue intercultural exchange, people need to commit for an amount of time. So it's these kind of exchanges need to go on, to talk for 2 hours, but for multiple weeks, so 4 to 8 weeks. And if half the participants drop out, then you lose. It fails for everybody, because it depends on the relationality and on the relationships you build and on the group developing. So we managed to create some successful programs, for example, with the youth organization in Beirut and another one in Naples, and they were working on environmental issues together. And that, it took like a few years to get set up, and it needed a lot of support. But I think maybe universities and NGOs and working with other organizations is something, we didn't explore, and which would certainly, I think, could bring a lot of critical, possibilities into the map. Have you had concrete experiences of using technologies in these engagements?
Are you asking me?
Yeah.
Yes, actually, how it came about was I used to lead a study abroad to the Dominican Republic, from the US to the Dominican Republic, a short-term study abroad. And with COVID, that was shut down. And so instead of working with a university in the Dominican Republic, I work with an NGO. And so I posed to them, well, could we do a virtual exchange instead? They were quite excited about it. And so we engaged in it last summer. And I hear what you're saying about some of the challenges. Our challenge was not motivation and staying with it, because in part, some of what you talked about earlier, the English language is something that they want to develop more. So they're quite interested and motivated. Our challenge was more related to technology and how, what you said in the beginning, how many devices are in a household, how many people are sharing a device, how often do they have access, power outages. But I think if on the one hand, when you're really thinking about critical perspectives and making virtual exchange available to more diverse kinds of people, I think moving it out of a university
absolutely
has a lot of potential.
I mean, we have colleagues who have taken virtual exchange to camp, who work with NGOs and who work in refugee camps and bring learners together with refugees for project work. That does happen. also under the auspices of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. I know exactly what you're talking about. It is often a gargantuan effort to pull it off the ground in those contexts in particular, but it gives a very unique learning experience for the students, and I guess for everybody else as well who is involved.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your question.
Can I make a comment?
Of course.
Hello, hello everyone. Thank you very much for this wonderful presentation. And I was actually thinking about other questions when Minda posed her question first, and got me thinking, Minda, because I've, like Francesca, and don't know if that relates to Emma as well, I'm a latecomer to decolonial epistemologies. And if we think about these critical decolonial perspectives from the South, for example, I have one advisee who's been proposing that perhaps we should look at knowledge as built outside the walls of, you know, the Eiffel Towers, of the university. And so we've been trying to not only listen to, but build from and with, not only from, but with communities. And in that sense, I think that your suggestion of, you know, maybe linking a virtual exchange to the communities makes a lot of sense. Though I mean, I don't have any experience with that, but I've been thinking about this, and I think it would be a good way to perhaps challenge and question the authority, the controls on who can say what knowledge is relevant and which one is not. And so, though I can see, like Francesca said, the practicalities, you know, who is going to set up and you know, what are we going to do about access to technology? Of course, we have to consider that. But though there are many difficulties, I think the issue is worth thinking about. So thank you for the suggestion.
Can I follow up on that? Oh,
Blanca,
sorry.
yeah, go for it. Go for it.
I have a question that I think is related to what Kyria is talking about, and hopefully, and Shazia, I hope I'm not hijacking your question, but I was thinking if you've had any experience or if you have any thoughts as to how the institutional context can facilitate or impede this kind of, I see you go, and you know, because what you talked about is how at its core, this kind of critical virtual exchange should be learner focused, and, you know, coming from this perspective of epistemological humility. And yet, you know, what my experience from a few years back was that this was a north-south attempt to have a collaboration between, you know, a state university in Mexico, non-prestigious, you know, but there was a long-standing relationship between faculty there and a professor in a Cal State system. And so we went to Cal State because they wanted to formalize this agreement, but the idea was that there was going to be, it was going to be focused on exchange of like students doing research with the faculty, but on local context, learning about, you know, how to do research, that kind of thing. And we were all very excited about it, but when we met with the dean, and she kept bringing up this question about, well, but what are you bringing? And there was a weird subtext, you know, in that she was framing it as, well, we want to make sure that we're all on an equal position because we don't want to, you know, overstep our boundaries or be like a dominant partner. But at the end of the day, what it sounded to us was like, you don't have equal resources to us, so therefore we will not participate in this with you. Whereas for us, you know, if that had come from a perspective of humility, we have lots of resources, we just don't have the same resources you do.
Of course.
But there was never that attempt at understanding that difference as a positive or a potential. It was seen as lesser than. Does that resonate?
Oh yeah, Fran, you want to talk to that?
I think it kind of in Europe they talk about cooperation projects, so cooperazione allo sviluppo, or capacity building. That's it. So that they set up these projects under a capacity building thing. So it's and the assumption is Europe builds the capacity of our partners in South Africa or in Brazil or whatever. And there's this horrible just in the discourse around it. And so people kind of get sucked into that. And then I think also once it starts getting, if it is institutional, and I think people can be coerced into having to do it, you know, so that the universities are showing that they're doing something. Capacity building is, to me, it ekes of colonialism. But that's how they give the funds. So universities have these capacity building programs. But I think working within that, then people can work. But again, I think it's people need to get out of that mindset, and how we do that it is an exchange. I mean, I really think the idea that it is an exchange and it is based on mutual learning, I mean, that should be the absolute premise, and nobody is teaching anybody anything. It's a process of mutual exchange, and, you know, everybody changing through the process.
The problem is that the educational decision takers and the administrators in the internationalization offices and so they're driven by totally different parameters.
Educators are too. I mean, again, a lot of people are. I think there just needs to be a whole load of work on kind of decolonizing in general, so for people to go into the projects with that idea. I mean, I think it's a whole kind of mindset change that we need in academia and internationalization. And yeah, starting from the discourses and the aims as well of the funders. I mean, you know, it's education is, you know, international education is soft power, and people are using it to promote their own agendas. But to what extent can we subvert it from within that?
Yeah. So another classic example is, so what are the learning outcomes? Yeah, virtual exchange has to come with student learning outcomes. Hate, because it's such an Anglo-Saxon way of going at it. Huh?
But they don't even necessarily, I mean, again, predefining the learning outcomes, then you're setting an agenda for it. So maybe
that's exactly what I mean. It's also very Anglo-Saxon approach, very Anglo-Saxon top-down approach. And these things often remain unquestioned, even by our own colleagues in virtual exchange work. There are very few who are kind of the anarchists of virtual exchange, who do the kind of work that Francesca and I are doing.
Shazia? Is it Shazia? Is that correct? Did you want to speak to your question?
Shazia.
Yeah, hi, this is Shazia from Dalhousie University. I am a newly appointed educational developer in internationalization and intercultural teaching competency. I've been part of a COIL, kind of an informal exchange with the University of Santiago in Chile. And that was kind of a friendly exchange as part of the, I don't want to use this word, but the package of contracts that were going on between the two universities. But my question is that and I'm seeing this increasingly, that there is an institutional preference to who to coordinate with. So it could be institutions and schools that accept the discourse that you have set. So for example, capacity building, if they're okay, if there is a top-down approach of, we don't know how to teach, you tell us, or you have better knowledge and we need to have that within our capacity. So I know that there is a colonial Stockholm syndrome as well, coming from, so I'm originally from Pakistan, lived almost, you know, kind of in different parts of the world, but at the same time, I kind of wrestle with this idea of what to do with this, because how do you fight these preferences or preferential treatments in the face of lack of resources, as Blanca was also talking about? What is it that your university is going to offer? I've been burned in proposing plans with universities that may not be as resourceful. The knowledge is not acknowledged. Yeah, and it's kind of still an unanswered question that I keep exploring in these sessions, and sometimes I get bits and pieces that I can use in my little part that I can play. But yeah, that's I just wanted to make a comment, but I also, if you would like to speak to it, and if you had to fight, and how did you, kind of what is it that you presented, and I'm like, okay, I'm gonna embellish my presentation in a way that it appeals to the university, but in the end sometimes it doesn't, because there are these possibilities and preferences. And I remember talking to him, I'm going on and on, but I remember talking to the head of the International Relations Office, and they used pronouns like they, these people don't follow through, these universities, it's not worth our while. And it was like this otherization of, like, to an extent that I cannot even imagine to describe. But yeah, so please, I would really love to hear anything, any kind of even solace that I can find in your comments. That would be wonderful. Thank you.
Oh, wish we had something. I recently go, Miriam, sorry.
Yeah, it is. I mean, maybe when you can often, what I often do is I slightly redirect the focus of these conversations on what the benefits for the students are, benefits that speak to those people. I'm not saying that these are the only benefits, but when we talked about the soft skills, the transversal skills, when we talked about the empathy, when we talked about curiosity, when we talked about conflict transformation, when we talk about collaborations, they can at least see collaboration skills online, how that also speaks to their agenda. So it's almost of kind of doing the work, yeah, a little bit under the radar, almost staying under the radar, catering to the discourse of those whose money and whose okay you need. But then when you do the work that you want to do. If that makes sense. You want to add to that, Francesca?
I was just thinking I was at this webinar organized, I think it was University of Cape Town, and they were talking about, global engagement and now in COVID, and they were talking about the massive opportunities it now brought to them, because, they would have these, what do they call it? Helicopter research teams that would kind of fly in and do these kind of so-called collaborative projects, but again, were quite kind of extractive in terms of getting the people on the ground to get the data for them, and then they would fly away and publish the research with their first names. And they were talking about how they saw the present situation as an opportunity for them, because these helicopter teams can't fly in anymore. And so they are kind of, the South Africans could dictate the agenda now on more equal terms, because they were they felt in a stronger position to be able to do that. And I think I don't know, that's just an example that really struck me, how, that perhaps the situation now can change things, but we need to, be ready to do it, to manage to do it. And again, no solutions here, because we face exactly the same problems here. I mean, my institution, there is no, now they are beginning to be interested in virtual exchange because of the problems with mobility. But again, they look at, if you give them a name of university, that the vice rector looks at the rankings of the university before, and that's what they seem to be interested in. But as Miriam was saying, I think there is this kind of doublespeak. You can talk to the competences agenda and have and you know, that can, you know, you speak their talk, but then you can do what you want to do underneath. Otherwise, yeah, you might not get the support or the funding or whatever is needed. Penny, you're at Durban. Where's Penny?
Yes, yeah, I'm in Durban.
Uh-huh.
Have you got connections here?
I've just been reading about Durban, and you have a COIL program.
Oh, yes, yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, we've got a COIL program, and you know, I'm just having that sort of dialogue in the chat. Is we do have this big move for decolonization and Africanization and so on, but I think, you know, even for us, we don't always really understand it. And I must say, I'm not. I think because I'm a white African or a white South African, you know, I tend to not want to have my voice there because I assume that I'm seen as a colonizer because I'm a white South African. So as much as I'm very aware of the issues, and I'm very, you know, I'm very supportive of it, and talking to my colleagues, I realize this issue of decolonizing your mind before you can understand, you know, how to really value your own knowledge and literacies and understandings and everything that you have to offer, you know, that in understanding things differently. But when I talk to colleagues of mine that are very enmeshed in decolonization, that seems to be, you know, an issue. And I think, you know, we still got a long way to go, even in getting to that stage. So it's always a sort of almost like a band-aid, you know, that's put on, and it's a very emotive kind of thing. But I really do believe that, you know, we through these COIL projects or the VE project, that students can really be the drivers and the leaders of this, of reconceptualizing knowledge, pushing these disciplinary boundaries, reimagining these disciplines, and understanding that, you know, if you're an engineer, you don't have to have done X, Y, and Z modules, that you can have some art modules within your engineering degree as well, you know, and perhaps these you know, going even broader, further on these sort of joint degrees, and the idea that you can pick up modules from, make up your own degree with all different sorts of modules, as long as you've got X number of credits or whatever, you know, and you can pick it from different universities and mesh them all together. And so, but I think students in COIL and virtual exchange, it really gives students this power to reimagine everything, you know, whatever it is. Yeah, so it's fabulous.
Laverne, his name came to me.
Yes, yeah, that's my boss.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, within higher education, we promote cross-disciplinary approaches. I mean, we talked about going outside of higher education, but within higher education, we're a strong promoter of what you just touched upon, Penny, these cross-disciplinary approaches where you have chemistry students with photography students working on plastic in the environment, for example. That's one that I mentored. And engineering students working with nursing students, creating care spaces together. Or any combination, really, outside of the box virtual exchanges, we call them. Because this is another beauty of it. It allows you to do some teaching and to create some curriculum that otherwise would have never existed. Not only are you bringing learners together that would have never met, you are teaching together with someone, or you are running a project together with someone, facilitating it with someone you probably would have never worked with. So there are so many unique points. And then, as I say, the possibility to create unique content. and exercise criticality in the context of all of this. Now I don't know, it is an hour is gone, I can't remember. Last time, did we do an hour and a half or an hour, or somebody help me, because Sharon isn't here. I don't know exactly whether we are supposed to wrap up or if there are any questions. I mean, I'm happy to hang around. What's the mood? Please give us some feedback.
I have one question if we have time, but
yeah.
I don't
okay.
know. Okay. Yeah, it's just, thank you so much. First of all, it's very, very, very interesting presentation. Yeah, a lot of, you know, thinking to do about this stuff. I was thinking about I wanted to ask about like sort of the student experience, you know, of international exchange, whether online or in person. And you were talking about this idea that, the idea that, you know, discovering, oh, we're not that different after all, is not really the point, right? And that more to the point would be this sort of process of, you know, developing humility first and then understanding that we're different, and that's the hard way, right? That's the real way of getting to actual, right, to decolonize and to actually engage with people from other places, right? But I was wondering if the we're not so different after all has a place in there, because I've had, you know, experiences with students who were very much, you know, I've worked with them abroad and they're kind of like, oh, this is not, you know, this is weird, I don't know what I'm doing here. And then had that moment of, we're not so different after all. And I saw that switch in them, and I saw at least maybe that could be a mid-step between there and then humility and then differences, right? And I'm just wondering if you want to speak to that. I mean, I just wonder if there is value in that, and just from my personal experience or not. Does that make sense?
It makes total sense, and it is in fact what happens, that you can't help it. You look for things in common because you want to get out into the zone. I call it getting into the zone of virtual exchange, because you only have these 5, 6, or 7 weeks, maybe 8 weeks to work together. So it is a human animal kind of. You look for things that you have in common, so that you feel safe, that you have this safe space from where you can go into the brave space and do the critical VE work. So I would see this on a continuum, maybe. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's what I'm wondering, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Fran?
I mean, I think that there's you don't want to kind of fetishize difference and always talk about difference, you know, so othering all the time. But then in the research, what I found is that very often those who say that we're all the same we're the same after all is perhaps, you know, you expect this huge difference, and then, you know, they're actually human, they're not subhuman. Is sometimes it's kind of like that, and I mean, that's a bit of an exaggeration, but it's I can't remember who wrote it, but somebody wrote this interesting piece where it's very much those with the power who say we're the same after all. Okay, whereas people need different things. So other people might say, as an outcome of an experience, is, you know, they felt listened to, and I recognize we're different, but you know, I can come to accept this difference, and I understand why we're different. Whereas this idea of we're all the same after all, and in the research I've done too, in exchanges between like students in the kind of the West and the predominantly Arab and Muslim world, it's very often the Western students who say, well, we're all the same after all. And the students in the predominantly Muslim world would say, you know, we are different. Yeah, we are different. I knew we are different, but, you know, I can kind of understand the differences better now, and I can accept them, or I can respect them better than I could before through the experience of exchange.
This is also so culturally determined, you know, ways of feeling comfortable with confrontation, let's say, for example, or ways of always seeking agreement. I live in a culture here in the UK where you do anything, I mean, I'm oversimplifying, but you avoid confrontation, you know. All these things play into this. And then you do all of this online, which comes with its own cultural conventions of using technology, of behaving in online spaces. We talked about this. So it is incredibly complex.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
I guess so. Sorry, just to finish up that thought. Just so not a question, but just a thought of like, how do we as educators like push students through that first section, right? How do we say, okay, we're the same. Okay, I feel humble about, you know, my worldview. Okay, we're different, right? Especially people from maybe a background that. Anyway, I think that's something to be thinking about. So thank you for that.
And I think sometimes it's through experiences, and also, you know, even, you know, also through reading, through text, through there are some really good, you know, texts that help you. I mean, you can't tell somebody what to think, but I think it's experiences that make you, you know, have a kind of aha moment. You can't tell somebody to be humble. I mean, it's through the realization and through experiences that you have, which challenge your worldview.
Or by using these resources that we also used talked about in the presentation, this talk on othering and belonging. You can use video clips as a starting point to bring these things to the fore. They're very good TED
and
talks
reflection,
on this
exactly.
issue.
And Minda says, yeah, the critical reflection as well. Absolutely.
Yeah. Anybody else? Any other questions? Thoughts, observations, sharing? Okay, I think we are good. And thank you everybody for coming and for engaging.
So we can share the slides maybe via Sharon?
Yeah, absolutely. We share the slides via the network, the recording even, I think, Francesca. Okay, let me just stop it. Just hang around for a moment. Cloud recording.